Well, hello small group, and welcome to AES 2026, and the first of our field visits for the year. And so I'd like to thank Luke for allowing us to do that, which is excellent. You know who I am, so I'm Graham Huon, and presently chair of the Melbourne section. Now tonight, Luke is taking us on a visit of the challenge of all we ever wanted to know about internet audio. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I won't preempt you by...
No?
I won't preempt myself by correcting it.
No.
I'll explain a bit of the difference between...
The twist is that it's practical experience. So it's based on the practical experience that he's had.
And I guess I would also, I draw a distinction between audio that goes over the internet for, what you might listen when you're, watching YouTube or whatever, versus low latency kind of bounded delivery time audio that you would use within a managed network, which is usually not going to, exit your premises. You can do that stuff over the internet, but it requires... and there have been some interesting demos of that stuff, but it requires, you need to really buy a slice of bandwidth from your ISP and kind of coordinate it end to end.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're going to have packets that are dropped.
No, we don't want to go near the public domain.
Or you need to have
apart from the software,
latency that's like, so large that it's not. Then it becomes a bit more like watching something on YouTube.
It is, and latency's rubbish. Well,
anyway.
It can be rubbish. Anyway, I'm sure that Luke will help us on our journey to better understand how these standards that AES has, 67 and 70, help us better understand both the open and proprietary standards that are around in the place. A bit about Luke, if you don't know Luke. Luke is a recognised composer and music producer based here in Melbourne. He's worked in the computer industry also for the last 30 years.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Started
Recently, he's been developing a personal monitor mixer that supports common audio over IP, AOIP, and supports protocols, or either works with protocols such as Dante, AVB and AES67 and others. I hope that I'll gain some insights from Luke on this journey and to find out how he's come from being a well-recognised composer to being a music producer in software as well as in composition. So I'd like to thank you very much, Luke, for taking the time.
I don't get to talk to people about stuff.
So give him a really warm welcome.
One of my friends. Thanks very much.
People you know.
People I know. I'll give you a bit of an overview. I should also add I'm pretty self-taught and new to the hardware and audio world. I've been working in music and computers for a long time, but never really mixed the two. So there's a lot of gaps in my knowledge, and I'm still learning a lot about it. So there's probably bits where you'll probably know more, and feel free to jump in. And again, I kind of did these slides pretty quickly, so I don't know how. Again, if it's too technical or not technical enough, just feel free to holler, and I'll skip over or go more depth.
I'm okay with the first slide.
The first slide, I was going to have an introduction slide that was like, you know why you're here, you don't need to know I am. So the general idea, and I guess just touching on what you said before, it's a bit more about audio over local networks, such as you'd find within a facility. Although it uses most of these protocols do use the same transport that you would use to send an email or stream something on YouTube. They're various they have properties, and I guess they're designed for environments where packets aren't going to be dropped, or at least hopefully they're not going to be dropped, and latency is pretty bounded, and you have a lot of bandwidth. So it's much more about trying to deliver like tens or hundreds of channels of audio with, I guess, sub-millisecond latencies, rather than it is, buffering your YouTube video. So I guess, why do you want to transport audio media over computer networks? I mean, it's a good question. Certainly in the video industry, where there's actually been some resistance to migrating to video over IP protocols, because in the video world, and again I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but the bandwidths are so large that the investment in things like network switches is really considerable, and the analog, as in the corollary of AES67 in the video world, SMT2110, there's like a website you can go to called Stop SMT2110 of people who would rather use coax, SDI and patch things manually and feel that networks have been shoved down their throat. So there is a little bit of cart before the horse, but things are a bit simpler in the audio world because the bandwidths are a lot more manageable. And I guess, yes, I'm sure as you guys know, historically, and certainly even in my lifetime, obviously, and still in your average pub, or many pubs, multiple channels of audio carry down analog snakes, which are heavy and expensive and expensive to repair. Whereas MADI is obviously another option, another AES standard, limited a bit by channel count and doesn't have the same commodity kind of drivers which computer networks have, which we'll get to in a second. But yeah, I mean, I guess one nice thing about computer networks also is they can extend globally. I mean, again, we're talking more about within their facility, but most places are wired up for Ethernet, so it's a lot easier to kind of take advantage of that existing investment. And I think that's another reason why this is popular, because the force of the computer industry is push down the prices of things like cabling, network switches, all that sort of stuff. So audio, which is a niche industry comparatively, can really leverage the economies of scale that computer networking has had. So even though it's a bit more complicated to transport audio media over a network than over synchronously over like MADI or something, there are kind of a bunch of things you kind of get, if not for free, very cheaply from the fact that computer networks are kind of everywhere. Another nice thing is you can share media and control data. So, I mean, a classic example might be like you've got some mic preamps with digital output. You want to be able to control the gain of the preamps remotely. I mean, you can kind of do that stuff over MADI. I think there's ancillary data, but it's a lot easier just to send some random packet down a network to do that. And AES70, which we'll get to a bit later in the talk, is an attempt to standardize some of that so that different vendors' products can be controlled by other vendors' controllers. So the problem, there is a catch, of course. There was a catch, and that things get complicated compared to like just sending it down a cable synchronously, where you don't have to deal with any other traffic, and the complexities are mostly to do with timing and congestion, which we will get back to in a second. I don't know. Any questions so far? No? Okay. People have wanted to send audio down networks for this kind of stuff for a long time, probably since the 90s. I think EtherSound, is from the 90s, and the evolution of the protocols has generally followed, I guess, the given that in the early days, I guess they were pretty much pushing the limits of what hardware could do to push that many channels over a network. So the evolution of the protocols has followed, I guess, evolution of hardware and its capabilities. So very early protocols really just took Ethernet, and sometimes not even the link layer, but just basically the electrical properties of Ethernet, and just shove packets down that. AES50, which is what you find in Behringer, a lot of Behringer mixing desks, uses Ethernet, but it also transmits a clock on unused pairs of the Ethernet cable. So one of the most difficult things about audio networks is clock recovery, and if you transmit a clock separately, then you can clock recovery becomes a lot simpler.
Is that Midas or is that Behringer?
Well, AES70 actually AES50 came out of Sony in Oxford, I think, was this thing called SuperMac and then HyperMac.
Hmm.
And then it just so happens that Behringer are pretty much the only ones that have adopted it, or Midas, or I don't know which. I mean, the Behringer and Midas, they often make the same product, just with different.
Behringer owns Midas.
But I don't know whether Midas adopted it first. But they're pretty much the only people that are using it, and it's kind of so a lot of these earlier things. One big disadvantage is that they're really point-to-point protocols, so they'll use the infrastructure of like some of the electrical or the chips that drive Ethernet, but you can't plug into an Ethernet switch. And in fact, if you plug AS50 cable into an Ethernet switch, something might blow up. I don't know, blow up, but it's definitely not going to work because
bring down the switch.
Yeah, you've got stuff you've got non-Ethernet things happening in some of the pairs. We're going to talk about AES67 a bit more in this talk. And AES67 is a very kind of, what would you call it? It's like just a very sensible marrying of existing protocols that already existed on the internet that we use for streaming, with some extra bits and pieces to give it, I wouldn't say reliable, but much more reliable delivery, and also the ability to recover clock more accurately. We'll talk about the clock stuff a bit more in a sec. AVB is another popular protocol. Again, I don't want to go into too much of the weeds. I've spent far too much time in AVB lately, but unlike AES67, it runs at layer 2, which means you can't route it between different networks. That's a bit unusual these days to have a layer 2 only protocol. It's a lot better. It comes from the IEEE. It's probably more, as the name might imply, it's probably a bit more engineered than AES67, but it's also perhaps a bit over-engineered, and a lot of the things that they optimized for, which make it perform really well on, say, 100 megabit per second networks, are maybe less, and people will argue over this, but probably less relevant now, and gigabit and faster Ethernet networks are popular. But it's definitely well engineered. I mean, it has a lot of nice properties. It's a total pain in the ass to implement, and it also requires that everything in the network, so every switch in between the thing that's sending audio and the thing that's receiving it, has to support AVB, and that is probably what has killed it in the market. I mean, it's still around, and it's used by a lot of PA vendors like D&B, L Acoustics.
All the Harman stuff.
Yeah, and what's the Adamson and Meyer are all using it for, I guess, that last mile between the mixing desk and the amplifier or the speaker. But it's the people that love it, but it's a pain, and I think it's hard to see how all of these different protocols are going to survive long term, because it's not great for consumers. I mean, it's basically like the early days of when I was a kid. I used to read like lots of computer magazines about networks, and there were all these different. There was Novell NetWare, and there's ArcNet, and there were all these different protocols, and eventually everything converged on TCP/IP. And I imagine something like that will happen with these, and AES67 is actually probably the most obvious candidate for that. And then Dante, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, it comes from an Australian company. That's been around for 20 years. They're probably one of the earliest commercial. I think it predates AES67 about the same time as AVB, but it's proprietary tech. It kind of, for some, more or less just works, and that's for some definition it just works, but because there's only a single implementation of it, so it's very you can run into issues with these open protocols where different vendors have interpreted the spec slightly differently. Dante is more of a plug and play. It runs with commodity hardware. It doesn't require special switches like AVB does. They've got a big chunk of the market, and there are many other audio Ethernet protocols, and there's even a new one that just came out this year called Hyperport from Digico. So weirdly, whilst you would think that as time went on we would converge on like a few like maybe one protocol, people can't seem to help themselves inventing more. But the big three in the industry are AES67, AVB, and Dante. And Dante can operate in an AES67 compatibility mode.
And Milan. Where
Yes.
does Milan fit in?
So Milan is basically AVB, except because there were enough, how to say it, not ambiguities, but there were enough things that were, not mandatory to implement in AVB.
Right.
Milan's basically, it's simply a profile. And you take AVB and then you say, okay, I'm just going to, in order to be Milan compliant, you need to implement AVB, and these are the bits you must implement with a guarantee, with a view to making those devices interoperable and plug and play.
Okay.
I won't bore you with the details, but it just basically nails down a bunch of things that were not, I wouldn't say they were unclear, but you could pick from a bunch of things in AVB, and they're like, okay, these are the ones. A simple example is the number of channels in a stream in AVB is kind of left to the implementer. Milan says you need to support 2, 4, 8, maybe just 2, 4, and 8 channels per stream.
Okay.
So once you've got those things nailed down, and the other good thing about Milan is that there's an industry consortium, and they have a test suite, a certification suite. So effectively, if a device gets certified, then it's going to work.
Yeah.
And that's that's designed to give, I guess, consumers a similar degree of confidence that things will just work to what you would get with something like Dante. Whereas AVB, you may or may not get that. You might have to do more futzing around. And I guess it's important to remember the audience consumers for a lot of these products are not IT guys or gals. They're like audio people or they're facilities people. There's often a political tension between IT departments and people working on this stuff. So the easier it is to just plug it in. I mean, most people can plug an Ethernet cable in, but when it gets more complex than that, and this is ironically one of the AVB Milan kind of people's argument is that, well, it's plug and play because the switch is very involved in how the audio is transported, but the irony is you need these special switches which are harder to find.
Okay.
I mean, Netgear, now that Netgear are making some, it's easier to find an AVB switch, but what really killed AVB was the fact that it required support from the switches, and very few vendors made them. And at the same time, here came Dante, and you could just go to Officeworks and buy a switch, and you didn't really have to configure it, and it just worked. And that was really the death knell for AVB, unfortunately.
Plus the price of the switches.
Yeah, the price of the switches. I mean, it's coming down now, but it's like this should have happened 20 years ago. Yeah, it's very hard to.
It's just got to switch off all the eco mode.
Yeah, well, that's
because Dante doesn't. Well,
none of this stuff likes
switches,
energy efficient Ethernet.
No, they don't like it.
The other smart thing Dante and AES67 did also is like there is some. It doesn't give you the same guarantees AVB does, but there are some ways of prioritizing traffic over networks, and one of the first uses of that was like voice over IP when you have like a phone in your office or whatever and you want to give the voice traffic priority. Dante and AES67 very cleverly use the same mechanism, the same way of prioritizing stuff. So that's kind of cool because most switches are going to come pre-configured for that.
Yeah.
So they're kind of smart, whereas again, it's a smart accident of like, if you leverage stuff that's been commoditized by other parts of the IT industry, then you can go to Officeworks and buy all the infrastructure. You don't need an expensive splitter. You can just get a switch. I mean, that's the other nice thing about this thing is like, I mean, it probably doesn't need to be explained, but if you want to do point to multipoint, which is very common, right? It's like, then you don't need any equipment because you just patch the stream to a bunch of destinations, and usually it's smart enough to use multicast, which is a way of sending packets, so you don't have to send them a bunch of times. You basically send it to this multicast address, and then the things that are interested say, hey, I want to subscribe to that, so it doesn't chew up more bandwidth for each subsequent listener.
I know it might go outside the primary thing of working inside a facility, but in terms of longer distance transmission, does AVB have limits that Dante doesn't have?
It's more the other way around. I mean, AVB is really hamstrung in the longer distance thing by operating at layer 2, which means it doesn't survive, it won't go past a router.
Yeah.
So in order to do that with AVB, you'd have to tunnel layer 2 inside layer 3. It can be done, but it would be simpler to use Dante or AES67. Generally, the way the long distance stuff works, the two constraints are like, okay, you've got to bump up your latency budget so that packets have got enough time to arrive, which is, just laws of physics. You probably want to rent some dedicated pipe from all of the intervening ISPs, and then you instead of sending the clock packet, and we'll touch upon the clocking stuff soon, but instead of deriving a common clock reference over the network, you want to use GPS, so that each end has its own reference, but it happens to be exactly the same because they're both locked to GPS. So you basically tell each end you've got different clock masters, but it just so happens the time is guaranteed to be the same.
It's universal.
Yeah, because otherwise the jitter over a long distance is going to make it more difficult to recover a clock. Touching a bit on like what we were talking about, what sort of came at the start, like what's the difference between just listening to audio on YouTube? And actually this was interesting to think about this, because I'd always known those things are quite different, but why don't you just buffer the packets? And the extreme example is I download an audio file and then I just play it back at my leisure. You don't have to worry about the latency is, well, at least the length of the song, but I don't have to worry about clocking. In fact, it's I can play it out with whatever reclocking, whatever I can go to great lengths to have the best, replay experience. And I don't have to worry about bandwidth reservation, because once the file's on your hard drive, your floppy disk, you just have to be able to read it off quickly enough. So that was a very extreme example of streaming. Most people wouldn't call it streaming, but it's good to consider the two ends of it. So what's different? And so the two or the three requirements that I came up with, and this is again sort of just, I haven't really seen anyone describe it like this, but one is synchronization, which is that everything needs to run at the same frequency. And this is...
You're trying clock frequency.
Yes.
Frame size.
Yeah. And that is so that you can mix stuff. And that's
without A or C.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Otherwise, obviously the same thing happens in the video world as well, but different frame rates, but to audio. But yeah, if you want to mix stuff, which is pretty common in the professional audio world, you need to be able to, and you want to do it in the digital domain and without a synchronous sample rate conversion, then everything that is sending audio needs to needs to be running at the same frequency. You also want to be synchronized, so that the things arrive in phase, and also that you can have some control over the playout time. So if you say have a bunch of different speakers, they're not just playing when the packets arrive, but maybe there's a buffer or something, but you have an absolute time reference, and you can say, okay, I want everything to play out at this particular time. And Dante and AVB and AES67 are different philosophies over how that works. AVB, the packets, and again, I might be getting a bit too into a rabbit warren here, but it'll take me longer to excuse it than it will to explain it. So AVB packets encode the playout time, so the time when it should be presented to the listener, or technically to the DACs. And then, whereas AES67, and Dante does the same as AVB, AES67 on the other hand encodes the time at which the audio is sampled, so you're kind of at the mercy of the transit time in order to have things line up and play at the same time. Of course, the flip side is with AVB, if you miss the presentation time deadline, then you're not going to hear any audio. I think AVB is probably the better approach, as long as you can tune the as long as you can tune the presentation time offsets. So if it's too conservative, But ultimately you end up having to do the same thing, which is, if you really care about this, you have to practically measure your network to see what the latency is, and either way tune things so that it's things play out at the same time. So that's the other thing is, quality of service. You need some means of assuring that the packets arrive, and I mean, on a network with only audio, you probably don't need to worry about that so much. As soon as you have a network that's shared with other traffic, like, you know, uploading large files, that kind of stuff, then you want to have some kind of quality of service mechanism. Generally, most people are going to probably going to have a completely separate network for audio. But again, I guess it's like nothing's stopping. There's nothing stopping you from making the audio not work by sending large amounts of other data over the network. So it's worth considering these things, and each different protocols have different philosophies about whether that should be addressed, if at all. I mean, AVB is the most meticulous about that, and because every switch needs to know about AVB, it will reserve bandwidth end to end for AVB traffic, and it won't actually provision the stream unless that bandwidth exists, which is super nice. But as we heard before, the price is that everything has to support it. Dante and AES67 are much more best effort, where which means exactly what it says. I mean, it's important to know that unlike something like MADI, Ethernet's asynchronous and best effort, so you don't really get any guarantees about when the packets arrive, or if they arrive at all. I mean, they can even arrive out of order. Not really sure I haven't looked too much at what the specs say about out of order packet arrival. I mean, I don't think there's an expectation that if a packet from like 10 minutes arrives, you're not going to wait 10 minutes for that, but certainly you're generally going to have a buffer of some number of samples in order to deal with the inherent jitter in something like Ethernet. And I guess if you can use that to deal with out of order packets, I think a lot of implementations don't though. And
unless the audio is attached to MPEG streaming.
Oh, in what sense?
MP4 streaming.
Yeah.
They rearrange the packets to increase the compression.
Yeah.
You can get a group of pictures of 250 and the audio is sliced up in different ways.
Yeah.
And relying on the timestamp in it to actually reconstruct the audio.
Yeah, I mean, most of this stuff does have, all of these protocols have a timestamp in the audio packets, but I don't think not all implementations, at least the ones I've seen, are able to handle out of order packets. And even if they are, the buffers are usually pretty small. I think AES67 mandates a 20 millisecond buffer. So if you're there's a limit on that. And in a managed network,
is that a minimum?
I think I guess it's a minimum. Yeah,
that's huge.
it is quite huge.
Yeah. That wouldn't work in a studio.
No. So yes, AES67's best thought. It's kind of like a lowest common denominator interoperability profile. I don't know if any of you guys have seen that XKCD cartoon about how standards are made, where a bunch of vendors come together and basically they just they find that instead of developing something new, I should have put that cartoon in here actually, they just try and find like what bits of our existing stuff can we sort of hammer together, and that's pretty much what AES67 is. There's Ravenna, Livewire, a few other, a few existing products that did audio over IP. AES67 is an attempt by those vendors, I guess, through the AES standardization process, but to really just cherry pick the things that were in common between those proprietary protocols and turn into a standard, which is great, but it also means that there's a lot of stuff that's either not in AES67 or literally is left to the implementer to choose from like one of three options, or four or whatever. And of course, if you do that, I mean, it goes without saying that different vendors will choose different options. They'll probably choose whatever's convenient and the least amount of work. And then that's how you end up with products that say they support AES67 and don't interoperate with each other, or only do so in a kind of very kludgy manner. So that is the unfortunate reality of AES67, is probably its biggest downside, and one reason why protocols like Dante, where everything is done for you effectively, have been popular in the market. Particularly, again, it's because the market's not IT people. People want something that work. And it's also the same with the vendors. The vendors are not computer engineers. Often they want something they can drop in, and the Dante solution is, if you manufacture a piece of digital audio gear and you're used to dealing with I2S and that sort of stuff, but don't know anything about networks, you can drop a Dante module in and kind of follow the reference and be up and running pretty quickly. So yeah, AES67 takes a thing called RTP, which is a real-time transport protocol, which is used for all sorts of things, including internet streaming, and it basically all it does, and it's why the spec is only like 30 pages long, is describes a way of anchoring that to a high accuracy clock using something called a precision time protocol. That is kind of it. It's pretty silent on discovery, which is how you find other devices. It's not silent on it, but it describes a bunch of different ways to do it, and not, as I said before, different vendors implement different ones, so that makes it effectively a bit on the useless side. Again, ironically, what's happened is that because Audinate, who make Dante, have one of the more popular AES67 implementations by size of deployment, everyone's kind of been forced to do what they do, because that's the one you want to interoperate with. Connection management, it doesn't say much about either, which is obviously how you connect one device to another. It does say a little bit about it, but again, without going to the weeds, not in a way that is useful. And then so different there's like a gazillion ways of doing connection management. There's AES70, which we'll talk about in a bit. There's NMOS. There's RTCP, real-time control protocol. There's SIP, which is used for what voice over IP uses when you call someone. So there's like at least 4 different ways. And again, I don't think I'm certain that no vendor implements all of them. So then it just becomes a Venn diagram of what works. And as I said before, they use the quality service settings that voice over IP would have used, which is kind of handy to distinguish different types of packets and their priorities. And it's generally used with multicast, which is when you send a packet which can arrive, it will be sent to a bunch of different, can be sent to many destinations without having to copy the packet, or without having to take more bandwidth. So clock synchronization is still something I'm learning about. Paul will probably correct me. I think until I actually try and implement it from scratch, I probably won't really understand it well enough to explain to anyone, but here goes. So you could just recover the clock from when the packets arrive, and a lot of the early audio over Ethernet protocols did this, but the presumption there is that there's no other traffic on the network. The early protocols that did this, they were really point to point. And again, if you've got a big file being transferred or something, then there goes your if you're trying to recover the clock from the media packets, then they're not going to arrive in time because they're going to get blocked by the switch. Audio packets are usually pretty small. It could be a few hundred bytes. A big file might use they might use a jumbo Ethernet frame. It could be 9,000 bytes. That frame, because frames are frames and they're not going to get cut up into little bits. If you've got you should never run jumbo Ethernet frames on an audio network. But let's say you had one, that packet's going to have to egress the switch before the next audio packet, and that's probably going to stuff up your clocking. And it's also not very amenable to software implementations because anything in a modern... this is ironically a case where computers from the 1980s were better, because before preemptive multitasking was a thing where the computer will just tell your application, switch your application out and switch another one in. And also because just the sheer amount of complexity in modern operating systems, basically there are no, there's no, you don't get any real-time guarantees. So if you're trying to recover timestamps from packet arrival time in to a high degree of accuracy in software, there's kind of no hope.
It used to be possible in Windows 95.
Yeah, or macOS, like
Yeah.
macOS before macOS 10.
Because you could run on the metal and
Yeah,
do it.
but that's not.
Rings
There's so much stuff. Even doing it in the kernel now is still probably too jittery. So there is kind of a nice thing about the single PTP, which I don't know. It's another IEEE standard. I don't know what the initial. I think AVB may. I'm not actually sure what the. But it's also now. It's probably a lot more popular in things like telecoms, where base stations need to have synchronized time. And power grids and that sort of stuff, things that where there's probably more money than there is in the audio industry. And PTP, ironically, is common to Dante, AVB and AES67, but amusingly they use all completely different incompatible profiles. But the beauty of PTP is not really anything about the protocol per se. It actually works, I think, pretty similarly to protocols like NTP, which you use to synchronize your computer, but a bit more with the precision and some of the kind of, and also it's designed to be used with hardware support, and that's kind of the key thing. Instead of trying to capture the timestamp, so we'll see about it in the next slide, but you basically, in order to recover a clock, you need to know when the time at which you sent a packet to the greatest accuracy possible and the time you received it. Doing that in software, or the further you get away from the actual Ethernet cable, the more jittery it's going to be, because the more stuff that is, well, it's in the software case likely to be non-deterministic. In a hardware case it might be deterministic, but you're still going to have to measure it, and that's going to be different for every piece of hardware, so that's more work to do. If you capture the timestamp in the actual Ethernet chip, which is called a MAC, I think it stands for Media Access Controller or something, or the PHY, which is the actual, even closer to that's the thing that turns it into a signal that can either a fiber optic signal or a twisted pair signal, differential signal, send out a cable. Then those timestamps can be super high accuracy, and basically you can report, as long as you don't need them like within the next nanosecond, you can report those timestamps back to the software, and it can do it. That can happen somewhat lazily, but it will know that they're accurate. And the nice thing about that is that in the endpoint, it's not going to be affected by any head of line blocking if you have a big packet, because it just gets timestamped when the packet goes out or comes in. And switches, it's a bit more complicated because yes, it can be disrupted, but there are ways around it. And the short answer, without going into the boring details, is that switches that are aware of PTP can timestamp packets that are PTP packets that are coming in and out, and adjust the timestamps on the fly to account for the time they spent resident in the switch, the residence time in the switch, which might is something that could increase if there are large packets being processed. PTP's nomenclature has been changed from master and slave recently to leader and follower, so I try and use the new terminology. And again, this is just one of those simple, beautiful, simultaneous equations that still I feel like I have to stare at like 10 times to understand. But, so you've got your server, this is your PTP server. That may or may not be the thing that's actually sending audio packets. It's kind of a separate bit of infrastructure, but something that everything on the network can take advantage of. Let's see if I can get this right. The server will broadcast or multicast its current time, usually a few times a second. Your audio device, will receive it at time t1. So at that point, you know a few things. You presume these two entities have separate clocks, because obviously no two devices are going to have a synchronized clock, unless you do something about it. And you also know that even though it's traveling at the speed of light, but there's going to be some time in the order of usually a few hundred nanoseconds that it takes the packet to traverse the network, and the more switches in the middle, then the longer that delay is going to be, and also obviously the more bursty traffic that might be blocking that. So at this point, you know, you on the receiving end, you know the time you received it at, because that's reported by the Mac, which we discussed in the previous slide, by the hardware. And you also know the time that the PDP server sent it at, because that's included in the packet you received. And then you send another packet which includes both of these timestamps, and the same thing happens at the other end. It notes the receipt time, and then it sends, its T3 is here sort of irrelevant, but then it sends another packet back to you which has all of the timestamps, and you note the timestamp, which is T2 dash or T2 prime, whatever, which you received it. So now, and I'll just go back to this slide, basically, you know, and there's some assumptions here, which is that the delay is symmetrical. So sending a packet in from A to B takes the same time as B to A, and there's certainly cases where that's not the case, and in that case you have to compensate for it manually. But assuming the delay is symmetrical, then you can add these two things together and, well, subtract one from the other actually, and then the delays cancel out, and then you just get twice the offset, and then the offset between the two clocks is half of those, given by that little equation there. Once you know the offset, then you just keep track of the offset, and then from that you can calculate from that phase offset you can calculate the frequency difference between the two clocks, and that's where the maths gets a bit beyond me, although I'm sure if I'd paid a bit more attention when I was younger it wouldn't be, but you can use that to discipline local oscillator, and then basically you just have a small FIFO, you put your audio packets in which are going to arrive, let's assume fairly jittery, because Ethernet is asynchronous, and the thing we're really interested in is just we don't really need the audio packets to arrive. They need to arrive within some bounds, but they don't need to arrive with particularly low jitter. So we'll just buffer them, and then with the oscillator that we've disciplined from the PTP clock, we can just play out those packets on clock edges. And then the actual things in between don't really need to. You can have hierarchies of clocks, and they don't actually need to. They can just keep track of the frequency and phase offset between the parent clock and pass it down the chain, and then only the thing at the very end needs to actually have a clock that it can speed up or slow down to turn into a audio word clock. So that's kind of the hairiest bit, and then RTP is, it's an existing internet protocol. All it is a packet of data with some PCM audio data in it, and it's got the two important things are basically, the sequence number's not even that important. There's two important things. One is the source identifier, so you can correlate it with who's sending it to you, and you can use that to look up other information, like what's the sample rate, what's the, some of these things you can infer from the packet rate and stuff, but generally the source identifier is a pointer into something else which which is available in the network, which tells you about the session, which I think we'll see in a bit. And then there's a timestamp, and in AES67 that timestamp, it's not a PGP timestamp, but there is it's basically a sample counter, but in AES67 the sample clock runs synchronously with the PTP clock, so sample 1 is at 48k, sample 1 is 1/48,000th of a second advanced from sample 0 in the PTP timescale. So you need to do a bit of maths, and then you play it out, and then you're kind of good to go. This is not that interesting really. It's kind of what I was telling you before about what the timestamps represent. Basically, your link offset, how long it takes to traverse a network, you need to account for. Otherwise, you're not going to be hearing anything. And AVB does that, and Dante did that a bit differently. There's a way of session discovery. This is one way of, again, AES67 frustratingly doesn't really mandate a single way to do it, but there's a way of sending this bit of information out on the network, and it might have some things like, what's the name of it, what's the IP address that it's being sent to, sample rate, how many bits it is, what's the clock reference. I think a few things got cut off here, unfortunately, but so that gives you enough information to, and this is stuff that's changing very slowly, so it's inefficient and not necessary to send in every audio packet, so this won't update, never, or once a day, or once an hour, or whatever. Usually be refreshed every minute or so, I think. So, yes, we touched a bit on control before. Suffice to say that AES67 doesn't really mandate anything, and that's pretty frustrating, and why Dante and AVB, well, it's why Dante succeeded. We know why AVB sort of hasn't, but both Dante and AVB have really strong control and monitoring to file some bugs. Where are we? Keynote. So yeah, it doesn't say much about that. And yeah, as I said, I mean, there's a bunch of different vendors. Autonate's a big one. Ravenna is like a little ecosystem of vendors like Merging and Neumann and Lavo. And again, it's basically AES67, but they have mandated, you should use this particular connection management protocol. Livewire, something that's used, I think, in broadcast a lot, like radio. I can't remember who it comes from, maybe Telos Alliance. Again, same kind of thing, just different different opinions about which ways of doing connection management. So you probably can get all of these things to interoperate, but you're going to need some elbow grease. And SMPTE 2110 uses AES67 as its audio transport, and indeed SMPTE 2110 is basically just the same idea. It's a bit more, I think it's a bit more detailed in terms of the control and monitoring stuff, but effectively, instead of PCM audio data, it's using RTP to transport video. And that's pretty much the end of the AES67 bit. I'm working on an open source AES67 implementation at the moment for XMOS, but it doesn't work yet, so I'm not going to show it to you. I was hoping to get it working today, but so that's that. And then I had a few slides on AES70, which is another AES standard. I don't know if you want to have a little breather and some questions or whatever, or you want me to just like smash through the last few slides and then we can do some. The internal priority could be the same actual priority but on a different VLAN. So I guess what I'm saying is that the switch chips probably do have the smarts to do all this. The degree to which it's exposed by actual products, you'd have to do your research. But the chips, underlying chips, can be very, very flexible in terms of how they're internal. By having a separate concept of an internal priority from what is actually on the network, then you can have different VLANs with the same priority traffic, or just unprioritized traffic mapped to different internal priorities, and then those internal priorities are mapped to different queues. So yes, what you say is definitely possible, but just because an actual switch chip implements it doesn't mean that the vendor making the switches provided the knobs for you to configure that.
I had a question about AVB.
Yeah.
Back in the dark ages, when it was first getting started, was trying to use that for networking in the studio.
Yeah.
And what killed it for us was, at the time, it wasn't supported
On Windows.
on the host
Oh, the host, yeah. Okay.
at all.
Yeah.
Even with the Phi,
Yeah.
with the cool Apple Phi, the one that does timestamping, and Apple was the only one doing it.
Yeah.
It didn't help you. Has that gotten resolved, or are you able to have what amounts to AVB drivers on
Yeah.
host and audio out of them.
For the simplicity of testing, I've only been using hardware to test. But I know the story in Windows is still no story. I mean,
Yeah, well,
yep, there's no story in Windows, and
nobody cares about Windows. But
macOS. It seems like they're still behind it. It seems like, just from reading the Avid audio forums, that every macOS release seems to break its AV implementation in a different way. But but it does work, and I think it actually now
so you
supports
can run it to a host.
Yeah, and look, I do remember doing that like 10 years ago with an Avid S3, which is now sitting on the top of the piano, and macOS at the time. I was able to record stuff off that. I've never really tried it since, and just from reading forums, I know I'm surprised AVB's been that things change as much, but I think people that are serious about AVB are using external USB or Thunderbolt interfaces, because it tends to be a bit less flaky, and you can also get lower latencies. But Apple stuff does support, a lot of modern. It's not Milan compliant, although they're thinking about it. I think they turned up to a plug fest recently, but it's Milan-ish. Like, it supports a lot of modern AVB features and quite high channel counts. But I haven't actually tried it for a while, and I know that there's some peculiarities. Like, for example, I go to Hive, which is the kind of patching thing. I don't see my Mac, but if I open, firstly, like audio MIDI setup,
Right.
is there even a network device browser? Can I see anything?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Sometimes it works. What happens? Audio devices, network, you can't see anything. No AVB devices. Maybe I need to turn Wi-Fi off. Nothing. And then there's always been like a secret terminal. There's always been like a secret thing. AVB util. There's always been this thing buried in. I mean, obviously, I can't see anything there either. Oh yeah, okay, I can see some stuff. You can see things, but
Well,
this is nowhere
there's control,
near.
but then there's getting
Yeah.
audio.
Yeah, and this is nowhere. This is not friendly for like mortals to use. Can I see anything like compared to Dante? Like, what is? These are all the different colours that a crosspoint can be. Like, it's not friendly. But I'm told it works. Maybe. Yes, I think it. My friend's been using it for his wavefield synthesis thing, and I think it does work. But I haven't tried it for a while.
Okay.
On to AES70. So this is a lot simpler, although weirdly it's probably harder to explain because it's one of those, like, a lot of infrastructure things. Like, well, what does it even do? But it's another AES standard, and it's really for monitoring and controlling devices. You can think of it simply as an abstraction of like switches and knobs on a device, but that can be controlled over a network. The two parties are controllers, which are things that control stuff, and devices, which are the server side, which is the thing that you control. It's an open standard. I mean, like AES standards you have to pay, but it's like $50 or whatever. One really nice property is that you can build a controller that knows nothing about the particular device, and it can discover all of the features, or as many features as the designer wants to be discovered. So that's really nice. So you can build tools that will work with any device and can control things that are in common, and that's a really beautiful property of it. I won't bore you with the details. I think we're probably getting a bit late in the day for that, but effectively it has an information model which is a hierarchy thing. So you might have like let's just say a channel strip on a mixer. That's a container which they call a block, and inside that block you might have like mic gain, mute button, trim. I mean, that's obviously a lot more things, but you'd have those things in those blocks. Then for every input channel you'd have one of those blocks, and then you could aggregate them in different ways. And This is something I can demo to you actually a bit. The different classes, things like buttons, they call actuators, sensors, things like a level meter. There are also ways of doing connection management and stuff, but I won't bore you with it. And I can give you a little demo of this. So, unfortunately, the good stuff is out there in my little workshop thing, but basically I'm building this device, which is, I'll just open the door so you can hear a sine wave. It's a little personal monitor mixer, which I alluded to before. That's be natural, whatever it is. Anyway, this is the UI, which you'll see on a touch screen, which is also out there. But one nice thing about the way I've built the UI is that it's actually just an OCA client, which is really nice because, well, firstly we get like a free iOS iPad app using all the same software, super nice. By free I mean I don't have to write any more code. But the other thing is it means you can manage these devices remotely, and eventually what I want to do is integrate this. So the idea of personal monitor mixer is every musician has one in a studio or in a gig, but integrate this with DAWs through DAW plugins so that you can save all of your monitor settings with the session, and then when you switch to tunes, you come back to a tune, you get back to the settings that everyone has. And I think that'll be a compelling point of difference compared to competing products. So this is currently using Dante because, as I said, AES67 implementation that I'm working on doesn't work yet. Now, why am I telling you about this? Because the fact that the way of controlling it is separated, the user interface is an OCA client, even though it runs on the device as well as remotely, but there's this thing, kind of like a broker or mediator, which is the OCA server, and that talks to the hardware, it talks to the Dante device, it talks to the chip that's doing the mixing. It also reads what the current temperature is. So like, for example, I go to settings, device, and say, okay, currently it's 41.87 degrees on the chip, that is. The backlight, all that stuff is controllable for OCA, which is really nice. So everything can be controlled remotely, everything can be persisted and saved as a patch and recalled, and it also means that opens up loads of possibilities for controlling a whole fleet of devices and copying and pasting settings between them. But what I wanted to show you, actually I'll show you a couple of things, but firstly I'll show you this thing called AES70 Explorer, which is a third-party app. So I can also unmute it from there. And this thing here really shows the hierarchy of, you've got a system folder, or it's a block. So we can see the CPU temperature, and if I want to pop it up here. I mean, this is not a very friendly interface, but it's very flexible, and it shows you how the objects in the device are arranged themselves. And then, look, okay, here are the 64 input channels, and each channel has a link button, a gain knob, pan, mute, solo, so that sort of stuff. Again, this is not a very intuitive way to present it to an end user, but it's an intuitive way to present it to a programmer. And then the thing is, both the actual user interface here and this, they're speaking exactly the same protocol. And it's all integrated with like Dante, so like and AVB. So here's a cool little device, cool little demo for like super nerds. One thing that's nice to do, right, is if you've got a bunch of these devices in a studio, you want to identify them. So, well, we've got a button for identifying it on the actual device, but it's kind of pretty pointless because if you're sitting in front of the device, you already know what it is. So that's why it lives in the debug menu and not in anywhere else. But I can go to Dante controller and click on the identify button here, and then that will also flash that up. So that's kind of handy because you may have 50 of these devices if you're doing an orchestral recording. I mean, I don't think I'll ever make that many, but you can even do it from you can right click on the device in the AVB manager, because this device also supports AVB. Sorry, where are we? Identify device, and that'll also flash that up there. So a nice thing too, this device supports both Dante and AVB, and I can just switch between them. Let's see if it works. Hang on a second. Change audio source to AVB Milan. Different pitch sine wave, because that's my other test tone. Let's change it back to Dante. So supporting both protocols is not only expensive, but also very complicated because they don't really like to share the same switch chip. But it was a very enjoyable technical challenge, and it also means a device that can basically drop into any environment, regardless of which. You could use it in a live gig where, one day, like someone that's hiring something out, right? One day you're in a gig with the mixing desk that supports Dante, another day with one that supports Milan, and you don't have to buy a different device, or you don't have to reflash the firmware. It's ready to do either. What else can I show you? Yeah, so this is still very much under development, but it's basically going to be a little box. I can actually show you. Just grab a little 3D printed version of it, which I've probably misplaced. It'll be a bit smaller than this, but and I won't have a display sitting around it, but it'll be something similar to this, but smaller, and got a few assignable encoders, XLR outs, two XLR outs, two Neutrik Ethercons, and two independently addressable headphone outs, and some power over Ethernet or over a barrel jack. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Well, thanks guys. Thanks so much.
No. It's a big thanks to you for
pleasure.
letting us come in and then.